Now, most of us know 1 Corinthians 15. We know that that particular section where Paul delivers the tradition which he himself recognized was part and parcel of the Christian faith, that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and he rose the third day according to the Scriptures, and who saw him in the order in which he was seen, etc., that most scholars identify as one of the most primitive elements of the Christian tradition. Dr. Price believes is actually an interpolation. It was put into 1 Corinthians. Whoever wrote 1 Corinthians, we don't know. But 1 Corinthians is written, and then 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 is inserted at a later point in time. Now, that kind of assertion that the text of the Bible could undergo this kind of radical emendation means that we wouldn't really have any idea of what the original authors ever wrote or who the original authors ever were. But I want to challenge this based upon the factual information that we have today. On the screen, you will notice I have the first writing of 1 Corinthians. As time goes by, a copy is made of this 1 Corinthians. And then another copy is made as time goes by, and more copies. This is the copying process that takes place over time. We can see this in the history of the transmission of the text of the New Testament. Then, at this point right here, we have the copy of 1 Corinthians that now inserts that text into chapter 15, verses 3 through 11. And so it's different than the others. And so then as time goes by, and here now we have the first time that we have the earliest manuscripts, when the New Testament writings emerge into history, what would we have? We would have two different kinds of 1 Corinthians. We would have multiple streams. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the presentation I made is that the New Testament manuscript tradition gives us multiple streams of transmission. And so as the text, the Gospels, John, Paul, etc., as we begin to see the earliest evidence of them, in the beginning of the 2nd century, for example, John, or at the end of the 2nd century for P46, for the epistles of Paul, already we detect that there are multiple streams of tradition, multiple streams of manuscripts that we see in the earliest manuscripts that we possess. They are not just simply copies of one copy of a copy, etc., etc. And so what would happen historically is we would have evidence of such a major disruption of the text. As Kurt Olland has put it, the New Testament text is tenacious. That is, once there is a reading in it, it stays in it. And when you have a major disruption of the text, it gives evidence of that. As Dr. Price has admitted, there is no New Testament manuscript evidence whatsoever that substantiates his assertion that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 is a later insertion into the text. But he says, but our earliest manuscripts are too late to actually answer that question. My assertion to you is that that manuscript tradition, even though the earliest we have comes from the end of the 2nd century, the late part of the 2nd century in P46, yet because of the nature of the evidence does give us documentary evidence that that text is not an interpolation. It was there from the beginning, and if it had been an interpolation, we would have evidence in it of that in the later manuscripts. What this really does is it challenges much of what Dr. Price says concerning the late date of the writing of the Gospels. Putting them into the 2nd century causes innumerable problems when we actually begin looking at what the manuscripts themselves say.